Man, hey, you guys have permission. It's 10:45, Super Bowl's after this hour. You have permission to preach back to me, okay? Last hour, there wasn't much talking. If you guys hear something that fires you up, preach back to me, please, okay? Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Let's change the atmosphere in this place, man. So if you guys have been traveling with us, we're in Joshua chapter 5. You guys can go ahead and turn there. We'll get there in a moment. So God has brought the Israelites a long way. They have traveled from slavery in Egypt, out of slavery, through the Red Sea, wandered in the wilderness, and now they're at the edge of the promise. They're getting ready to enter into the conquest of Canaan, which is the promised land. God made this promise to them over 400 years ago to a guy named Abraham, that he would give them this land as a blessing. So God has raised up a man named Joshua to lead the Israelites in this conquest. And I'm thinking about Joshua and how God has brought them to the edge of the promise. And if you were here last week, they just crossed the Jordan River. So God dried up the waters in the Jordan River during flood season. Miracle after miracle after miracle. They crossed over on dry land. And now they're on the west side of the Jordan River. And Jericho is just in the distance. They can see Jericho. Jericho is the first battle on the conquest of Canaan. And I'm thinking about Joshua and what he must be feeling during these moments, right? They're camped out on the west side of the Jordan, getting ready for the battle at Jericho. And Joshua has been here before. He stood on this very land 40 years prior. I'm thinking back to when him and Caleb were the only two that believed in the promise of God. 40 years prior, God had sent out 12 spies, and they all came back, and Joshua and Caleb were the only ones who believed. And it says in Numbers chapter 13, 40 years prior, we went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. You were right, God, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Everyone was stricken with fear in the camp. The only people who weren't afraid were Joshua and Caleb. And we see that God actually judged his people, and he had them wander in the wilderness for 40 years because they weren't ready. They weren't ready. They weren't ready to start the conquest of Canaan. They wouldn't have made it. So we see that they're at the edge of the promise. They're here. Joshua's in the same spot. And nothing has changed on the outside, you guys. The walls are still there. The Israelites didn't just grow and now they're giants too. Everything on the outside's the same, but everything on the inside has changed. And we see that the walls were massive, and there's a reason why 40 years prior they said they felt like grasshoppers. And I have some pictures of the walls of Jericho, and I've actually been there twice, and I've seen the remnants of what was the wall. So just so you guys can get some context, this, if you look to the very right of the picture, there's what we call a rampart wall. So this picture doesn't do that justice, but the land starts to increase in elevation before you even get to the first wall. You always built your kingdom on a hill. It gave you the advantage. So the rampart wall, the ground is naturally increasing in elevation. Then you build your first wall. That wall is 6 feet wide, about 20 feet high. And then the ground is still increasing, you see, after that first wall. And in between the two walls is where Rahab lived. So that's Rahab the spy. She was in Joshua chapter 3, 4. That's where she lived. And then the ground is still increasing, and then you put your second wall. That wall went up about 20 more feet as well. So we're gonna go to the second picture, and this is an aerial view of what the city of Jericho would have looked like. So you can imagine being at the very bottom of that wall and looking up at the incline and the two walls staggered. It's over 60 feet of wall. And of course you would feel like a grasshopper, right? And I'm thinking about how the Israelites are getting ready to face one of the largest walls that they've come up against. And I couldn't help but think about the walls that we hit in our life. And maybe if you're not old enough, you haven't hit some serious walls. I remember the first wall that I hit, I think I was 17. First time I had my heart broken. That was a small wall. And thank God he brought me through that one. The second wall I can remember is I had hip surgery after I was done playing football. And I was just like, what? Like, I thought my body was invincible. Like, what's going on? Hip surgery? Kidding me? And even then seeing my mom have a stroke and her being paralyzed, that was another wall that I hit. I was actually in the doctor's just this last week, and I told him, I was like, man, getting old sucks. And he's like, hey, it's better than the alternative. It's like, dude, touche, you got me there. So when I think about if you've hit a wall, you know what it feels like. Have you guys ever hit a wall and it's left you saying the words, I can't do this? Yeah, you can preach back, it's good, you have permission. I can't go on. I don't know how I'm gonna get past this. Or when you hit a wall, the feelings you feel are exposed. You feel weak. You feel like a failure. Those are the feelings you get when you hit a wall. And so often, the bigger the wall in our life, the more hopeless the situation feels, right? And I don't know what walls you guys are facing, but I know as life goes on, we usually end up facing more and more walls. And sometimes we face walls that we never even asked for, right? It's like, what is this? I didn't ask for this. I don't know, it could be anything, right? There could be people you know that are facing walls of addiction. Maybe there's friends that you know that are facing walls of divorce, you know? Maybe, cancer. You're on your 6th round of chemo and you're just like, what is going on? So there's so many walls that we face. And we didn't ask for these walls. And then there's some walls, you guys, that we face that we create ourselves. Did you know there's walls of self-doubt that we build up in our heart? Walls of unforgiveness, right? Walls of entitlement. From about 2 to 18 years old, that's your wall. You're camped out at that wall. You think the whole world just revolves around you, right? So I'm thinking about these walls that we face on the inside and how when we come up against walls, the bigger the wall, the more hopeless the situation, not when you serve the Lord. The bigger the wall, the greater the purpose he has for your life. I'm telling you. The bigger the wall, the greater the purpose he has for your life. And you know what the problem is sometimes we're so focused on the walls outside of us when in reality, God's waiting for the walls inside of us to come down. That's what's happening. So the walls outside of us rarely fall until they first fall within us. Yeah, so sometimes we're fixated on the walls outside of us. And I had a friend that just went through some counseling and he was telling me about it. And he's like, he was talking to his counselor and he's like, every time I relate to her, this happens and this. And I get so mad at it. And the counselor said, excuse me, please, can you guys stop for a second? You're telling me about what's going on outside of you. I want to hear about what's going on inside of you. Why do these things make you feel this way? Sometimes we're so focused on what's going on outside of us, and we don't realize that God is trying to get us to focus on the walls inside of us. And when we hit a wall, we feel exposed and we feel weak and we feel like a failure. And if you're there today, I want to say, man, the soil is fertile for God to do his best work in your life, because it's in our moments of weakness where his strength is most powerfully demonstrated in our lives. It's in our moment of weakness where his strength is most powerfully demonstrated in our lives. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest powerfully upon me. I delight in weakness. I delight in insults. I delight in hardships. I delight in persecution and difficulties. There's walls in my life, bring it on. For when I am weak, it is then that I'm really strong. So Joshua and the Israelites didn't know how they were going to face this wall. Like, let's be honest. They had no idea. And you know what we do sometimes? We're so fixated on the wall and our problems, sometimes that's all we can think about. And you know what God has called us to focus on? Not the walls. He's called us to focus on his promise. And it's the same thing with Joshua, you guys. Joshua chapter 1, like this is old news, right? He made a promise. He said, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. He said, be strong and courageous. The walls will fall. Everywhere your feet touch, I will give you that land. But this is the point of my message, you guys. All week long, everybody's like, that's not going to make sense. It's going to go over their heads. So prove them wrong right now with me, okay? God has made a promise. We have to see the promise in the process. We have to see the promise in the process. And this is what I mean by that. You think Joshua just woke up one day and he was strong and courageous? Just woke up like this, your Instagram picture in the morning, you know? No, you didn't. You didn't wake up like that. Joshua didn't wake up strong and courageous. You know what he woke up into? Slavery in Egypt. He was born into slavery. You know what he did after that? Wandered for 40 years. You know what he did after that? Sat under the leadership of Moses as his assistant. The promise is in the process. And also, this illustration will help, right? We know that God has made Tom Brady a promise that he will win the Super Bowl, right? But, preach, that promise isn't found when Tom's holding that Super Bowl trophy up, right? The promise is in the process. It's in the off season. It's during the workouts. It's during the hours of film. It's the early mornings. It's the late nights. The promise is found in the process. You gotta see the promise in the process. My best friend was just talking to me 3 days ago, and he's on a health journey, and he's like, man, he's like, this body fat's gotta be able to come off faster. He's like, there's gotta be a quicker way. And I said, well, how long did it take to put on? He just looked at me and walked away. And he said, you're right. Sometimes we hate the process, you guys. Sometimes we can't stand the process. That's where God works. But we've got to see the promise in the process. So Joshua chapter 5, verse 1. It says, now when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear. And they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. And if you guys are following along in your Bibles, verse 2 through 9 talks about circumcision, and I'm not going to go there today. Scott Swanson said he's going to do a learning community on that after this hour. So if you guys are interested in that, go see him after this service. I'm going to laugh. We're going to have like 500 people show up to no meeting. All God's doing is he's preparing his people. He's preparing his people to enter into the promised land. Verse 10. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. You know why I love this? You know what the Passover was? They were looking back to 40 years prior, celebrating the Passover, celebrating the fact that God delivered them out of Egypt, out of slavery, into a better future. So it's them looking back in the past and saying, God, you were faithful. You were with us. The promise is in the process. You never left us. You didn't forsake us. So because based on your faithfulness in our past, we can trust you in the present. And I wanted to ask, how many times have you guys stopped just to reflect back on your life and say, wow, God, you have brought me so far. And here I am getting anxious and freaking out like I'm so prone to be doing, when all I got to do is look back and thank you for how you were so present in my life. That's what they were doing, the Passover, celebrating the fact that God is faithful in the past so they can trust him in the present. Verse 11, the day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, the promised land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate produce of the promised land. I love this. This is such a beautiful picture of how God is so present in our lives. The Passover, he's faithful. Look back. Manna, he provides for your everyday needs. And then also, this is a picture of what God is getting ready to do in their lives, bringing them from something old into something new, the promised land. I was reflecting on how far God had brought his people. He brought them from Egypt to Jericho. How many people know that from Egypt to Jericho, it's actually only 250 miles? Did you know that it'd take us about 4 hours to drive that? It would take the Israelites about 1 month to walk it. Why did it take them 40 years to go 250 miles? Yeah. AKA their hearts, right? And I was thinking about how sometimes I feel like it's taken me 40 years to go 250 miles. Can anybody relate? How many people are working a job right now and you're like, really, Lord? Is this what you've called me to? Is this it? I mean, or maybe you don't have a job and you've been unemployed and you're like, what's going on, Lord? Maybe it's a relationship and it's just a downward spiral and you're like, how am I gonna get out of this? I feel like I'm wandering. I can think of a time in my life where I felt like it took me 40 years to go 250 miles. You guys, I went to college, got my 4-year degree, the degree that's supposed to set you up for what you want to be doing, right? I graduate and I'm like, man, what am I going to do next? So get ready, parents. That's usually what happens to your kids, okay? So don't be freaking out when they graduate with a degree that's supposed to lead them to their calling, right? So I was like, what am I going to do next? And I felt like God was telling me to apply for a scholarship to get my MDiv, which is a pastoral degree. And I'm like, really? Like, you want me to be a pastor? All right, let's do this. End up getting this scholarship. And it's a miracle. Go into that some other time. Got this scholarship. And I'm in seminary. And my first year, I end up getting a C+ in one of my classes. This is a scholarly scholarship. So you know what happens? I lose my scholarship. I hit a wall. I felt like a complete failure. I was like, man, you're calling me to be a pastor? And I think that was probably a preaching class that I got a C in too. I'm just kidding, it wasn't. It wasn't. So you guys know what I did after I failed out of my scholarship? I applied for a full-time staff position at the same school that I lost my scholarship from. And I got the job. And you know what that job gave me? A 75% tuition discount towards my MDiv. Wow. You know what I was? The assistant manager of event services. Yeah. Hated my job. You guys, I can't even explain to you how much I hated my job. This was probably the most depressing, most miserable 2 years of my life. So this is what I was doing. I was the assistant manager, so I did everything that the manager was supposed to do, because that's what assistant managers do. I was working 60 hours a week. He told me it's a great job, but you make your money in your overtime. Awesome. 60 hours a week. I'm the ticket manager, because I went to school for that, right? So you know what I'm doing? I'm selling tickets for all of our theatrical performances and all of our sporting events. I went from playing football to selling tickets for football games in the ticket booth. Man, I felt like a success. I couldn't even go watch the games. It's miserable. You know what else I got to do? As well as working on my seminary classes at night or on the weekends, I got to lead teams of college students and set them up for success during the workplace. I got to work alongside them. I got to hear their story. I got to learn about how I could be there for them. Fast forward just 5 years later, what am I doing now? Working with college students, leading them to places like Haiti. And I tell you what, if I didn't have those managerial skills and the admin skills that I learned while I was there, I'd be struggling right now. And that's what I mean. The promise is in the process. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we feel like we're wandering, right? It's taken us 40 years to go 250 miles. You have to have the eyes to see that the promise is in the process. And you guys, here's something else, okay? All week long, they're like, Nate, you come up with these tweetable lines, but they don't make sense. And I'm about to give it to you guys right now, and you're gonna be like, it makes perfect sense. Are you ready? Here it is. When you can see the promise in the process, it brings so much purpose to the present. Whew. Over everybody's head, right? No. Hey, and this is what I mean, okay? When you can see the promise in the process, it brings so much purpose to the present. I have a buddy who's working at Starbucks. He's been there for 2 years. And not that Starbucks isn't a great career, but he says he feels like God has called him to something bigger. And I think if God has called you to something bigger than Starbucks for the rest of your life, I think that's okay. So he told me, he's like, man, I'm just struggling. But he recognizes that the promise is in the process. So you know what he does? He creates an experience with every single cup of coffee that's served that those customers never forget. He wins Employee of the Month like every other month. It's crazy. He recognizes that the promise is in the process, and that brings so much purpose to the present. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are. It doesn't matter where you're at. I'm telling you, when you see the promise and you recognize that it's found in the process, it changes everything. And some of us feel like we're in that desert season. And I want to tell you, the desert season is what brought Joshua to Jericho. And some of you are like, Lord, you actually brought me to the desert. Like I'm here in the desert of Arizona and I don't want to be here. Why? And to you, I say, Hosea chapter 2, verse 14 says, therefore, I am now going to allure her or win her back. I will lead her into the desert to speak tenderly to her. God never, ever wastes a dry season. Sometimes it's to silence the noise. Sometimes, just like the Israelites, it's to win them back. It's to teach you to completely trust and depend fully on his presence in your life. That's why the Israelites were wandering for 40 years. So here Joshua is, he's reflecting on the Passover. He's seen how far God brought them and that the promise is found in the process. And he's probably freaking out a little bit too. So Joshua wanders away from the camp after the celebration and he encounters someone. Joshua chapter 5, verse 13. It says, now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, are you for us or against us? And the man said, neither. It's weird. He said, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, he said, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. And Joshua did so. And the commander goes on to say, now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and nobody came in. The Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and all of its fighting men. So here God is reminding Joshua that he's with him. And you want to know what too? Most scholars believe that this is Jesus Christ, pre-incarnate. And I believe this too. And this is why, because if you go to Revelation chapter 22, verse 9 with me just for a second, John the Revelator, John the person who wrote the book of Revelation, he encountered an angel, much like Joshua did here. John falls face down in reverence to worship this angel. And you know what the angel says to him? He says, don't do that. Stop. He says, get up. He says, don't worship me. I'm a fellow servant. He says, worship God. You see, angels don't accept worship. So we have so much reason to believe that this is Jesus who meets Joshua in what I believe could be a moment of weakness. Joshua didn't know how they were going to conquer the walls of Jericho. And so we see that they celebrate the Passover, recognizing that God has provided for them in the past. And even in the present moment, Jesus shows up to encourage him, to strengthen him, to give him faith, to remind him that the battle is already won, sword in hand. The battle's not even yours to begin with. You just need to let the Lord fight for you. And this is the reason why I believe that some of us don't recognize the promise in the process. It's because we're not walking on purpose. So God gives them the most bizarre, the most irrational instructions for how they're supposed to face the walls in their life. I'm just going to read this for you, okay? You can see how bizarre this is. Joshua chapter 6, verse 3. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. So march around the city one time every single day for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, he said, take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it. And he ordered the army, advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord, and the walls will fall down. And they did that. For 6 days, they marched around the city one time. And on the 7th day, they marched around the city 7 times. And Joshua told them, don't say a word until the 7th lap is completed. And then give a loud shout and the walls will fall down. And the walls fell down and they conquered the city. And I was thinking about this passage and how God called them. It's so easy to look at this and be like, the Israelites were just walking in circles. No, they weren't walking in circles. They were walking on purpose. God had given them such specific, detailed instructions on how to face the walls in their life. And I just wanted to ask all of us, what are some of the things that God has called you to be doing? How has God called you to be walking on purpose? I truly believe in my heart that, if we believe what we believe, it's so easy for us to focus on our walls, but God has spoken directions and intention and plans into our hearts in order to see these walls fall. And he calls us to walk on purpose. He calls us to a relationship that is intentional. And I was even thinking about this. I was talking to a buddy, and we were just talking about how to take advantage of his life and really see some breakthrough. And I said, what are some things that you do on a consistent basis? Tell me one thing that you do every single day in order to face these challenges. What's one thing that you do every single day in order to better yourself, to grow your relationship with the Lord? And he just, I eat breakfast every day, And I'm like, dude, come on, seriously. And there's been moments in my life where I've asked myself the same question, and there's no consistency in my life. There's no intention. And sometimes I just feel like I'm walking in circles. You know what I did recently when I felt this way? I started creating some new habits in my life. Have you guys heard of bulletproof coffee? Yeah? So if you haven't, listen to how weird this is. Every morning I wake up, I make a cup of coffee, I put a tablespoon of organic grass-fed butter in it and coconut oil, and I blend it up, and it's the best latte I've ever had. Started doing that every day. I'm not a doctor or nutritionist, so I'm not telling you to go home and do this, but I love it. It's my favorite part of my day, just to create some more consistency in my life. You know what else I do? I have 3 devotionals that are a non-negotiable for me. No matter what I'm reading, no matter what book I'm going through, I read these 3 devotionals every single day. And there's been times where I forgot to read them, right? And then I get to the end of the day and I read it and I'm like, man, I wish I would have had that truth earlier. Could have used that today. And it's funny, and I'm just like, I know God has called us to be doing small things, to be walking on purpose in order to see these walls fall down. I just wanted to ask, what are some things that you're doing? What are some things that maybe God has called you to stop doing some things, And the reason why is because, you guys, Jericho was just the beginning. Joshua went on to face 30 more kings. That's the reason we need to be walking on purpose, is because the battle's just begun. You're gonna face one wall to get to another. What is your Jericho? What's that thing that you're circling in prayer, trusting the Lord in, and that you're walking around, right? You know what some of us do? This is what we do. All of us, even myself. We face a wall, right? And you know what we do? We come to the foot of the wall, and man, we just camp out, and we just take a seat at the foot of the wall. This is what we do. And you know why we do this? Because it's so much easier. And so I'm at a financial wall, right? And I'm just chilling here. And you know what happens? Some other friends start to meet me at this wall, and we just camp out. And you know what I do? All I do is talk about the wall. Man, this is my 3rd job in 4 months. I don't know why my boss doesn't like me. I showed up late 3 times, and he told me he was gonna write me up. Where's the grace, Or, yeah, they're telling me I need to do a budget. They said this guy, Dave Ramsey, does these classes somewhere. I don't know what they're talking about. But I'm the best Call of Duty player in the world. And I can play Xbox like no other. And also, too, we sit at the wall of unforgiveness, right? And I love this wall. Honestly, it's the most damaging. And I'm camped out at this wall, and my buddies are here, and I'm like, yeah, man, I've been sleeping on the couch for 5 nights. She thinks I'm gonna apologize to her. No way. And your buddy's like, yeah, man, keep camping out on the couch. That'll teach her. Idiot. So stupid. Or my favorite is the wall of offense. Oh, there's so many people who face this wall, especially in churches, Yeah, I don't resonate with the teaching of that church. Yeah, this is my 5th one in 12 months. I'm just trying to find something that just sits well with me, I don't find any community at that church. They keep talking about life groups. I don't know what that is. So no wonder you feel alone, right? It's no wonder you feel isolated. And the reason why we don't want to walk on purpose is because sometimes there are things that we don't want to do, right? They're the things that God has called us to do, and we know it deep down, but I don't feel like doing it. You think the Israelites felt like walking around with trumpets? I don't know, man. I feel like I can get in their head, right? And I know they had these thoughts. They're walking around this wall, over 60 feet of wall, and I guarantee one of them's like, oh my gosh, there's no way this thing's falling down. But I can't focus on that because God has called me to walk on purpose. You know what I would have been thinking? There's gonna be some arrows that are gonna fly over this wall and take us out right now. I can't focus on that because God has called me to walk on purpose. He says, don't look to the left, don't look to the right. Focus on my voice. I've given you clear instructions. Walk on purpose. And some of us are on lap 6 and we want to give up. Don't stop on 6. Walk on purpose. Trust the Lord. And I'm telling you, there's people in this room today that are facing a financial wall. Your finances are struggling. You don't know what to do. You can't remember the last time you tithed. And you know what God's asking you to do? Give again. There's people in this room whose relationships are struggling. Your marriage has grown cold. You're facing the wall of divorce. How did you get so far? And you know what God's asking you to do? Love again. There's people in this room that have been hurt so bad, and you're waiting for an apology. You know what God is asking you to do? Forgive again. Forgive again and forgive again and forgive again. Don't focus on the wall. Focus on my purpose. Walk on purpose. There's people in this room that maybe have lost faith. You don't know what to believe in. And sometimes we think, you guys, it takes the most massive amount of faith in order to see mountains move in our lives. You know how much faith it takes? Faith the size of a mustard seed. A mustard seed. Do you remember when Palmer had us hold a mustard seed in our hands? Just a little bit of faith. Just a little bit of faith. I want to ask right now that you guys stand with me. Bring the Lord your mustard seed of faith and watch him move mountains in your life. Even when the walls don't fall, the promise still stands.